Hi, I'm Alex Colopy, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Denisha Jones about protecting childhood in play, engaging race in early childhood education, and teacher activism in policy and practice. Denisha holds a Ph.D. in curriculum and instruction from Indiana University and a J.D. from the University of the District of Columbia. She's a former preschool and kindergarten teacher and preschool director. She's served on faculty and teacher education at several universities and in her current role as director of the Art of Teaching program at Sarah Lawrence College. Denisha is the co-director of Defending the Early Years, the assistant executive director of Badass Teachers Association, and a steering committee member of Black Lives Matter at School. Thanks for your time today, Denisha.
Thanks, Alex, for having me.
I'm wondering if you can first tell us a bit about your experience as a teacher and what led you to the work that you do today.
Sure. I was one of those people who decided I wanted to be a teacher when I was like 10 or 12. Always really liked babysitting and working with kids and wanted to do that. And in high school in New Jersey, I got to leave early my senior year and go to an elementary school and work in a first grade classroom. And that's when I really enjoyed working with the child who was kind of like left out, who wasn't included, who wasn't getting the curriculum. I'm like working with them on one. I finally got to become a teacher in 2003. I finished my bachelor's degree at university, and then I quickly realized that being a teacher is not what I thought it was going to be, right? I had, 23 kindergarten students, different ages, different abilities. It was one of the most challenging years I've ever had. It was one of the most challenging jobs I've ever had as a kindergarten teacher. And I realized that there was a lot that I just wasn't prepared for. There was a big push at that time. We just had Michelle Rhee become the superintendent of DC Public Schools, and there was this big push for testing 5-year-olds. And I'm like, you mean the 5-year-olds who don't know how to get along, who don't know how to enjoy each other's company? Like, you want me to prepare them to take a standardized test, right? So it was just a really disconnect on what I was being asked to do and what I thought I needed to do and what I needed to work on in the classroom. So I do what a lot of people do when they don't know what to do in their career. I went back to school. I went to Indiana University, worked on my dissertation there, and then I started to learn history of public education, of curriculum development, and I started to get a better sense of why there was all these struggles, right? Because there are people with power who really wanted to make education more efficient and to weed out children and into probable destinations, as opposed to people like me who wanted to make education more of a social reconstructionist project where we address issues of oppression, right, and discrimination, right? And so once I realized these ideological battles playing out in the school system, I was like, oh, this makes sense about what I was trying to do and what I was up against in the classroom. But I also discovered a passion for teaching college students, right? I started doing that. So I finished up there. I did do I was a preschool director, and then I started teaching full-time at university, starting with Howard University and to where I'm at now, and really doing teacher education. And my biggest mantra in this work is that, one, I want to make sure that they feel more prepared than I do, right? So what areas were I not prepared for? I wasn't prepared for assessment. Didn't really come through really strongly in my program. I wasn't prepared for working with parents, right? And I wasn't prepared for pushing back against these oppressive systems that show up in our schools every day. So those are the things I kind of take into my work, except the assessment, I've even flipped that a little bit because assessment is one of the oppressive structures, right? So I try and really approach that with my students. And then through this work, I got really involved in just educational justice activist work when I returned to DC in 2011. There was a lot happening at that time regarding, in Wisconsin at the time, the governor who had tried to take away the teachers' collective bargaining rights. So we saw a lot of just teachers really speaking up, right? Kind of like an education spring almost. Teachers were just like, we had a big event in Washington, DC in 2011, and there, all these teachers came in droves in the mall, and we had a huge, so that really was the catalyst to my work as an education activist. And then really continuing this work of thinking about racial justice in education and with the Black Lives Matter at School, which is a national movement that really started in 2017. And I've been fortunate to work with them and to work locally in both in DC and now in New York City.
So something that I read across your work, whether it's the Black Lives Matter work in schools or the activism against assessment, as well as your writing about what you refer to as true play, I see this related overwhelming concern for protecting the rights of the child. And so it seems that you are advocating for teachers to facilitate a certain kind of environment where children can really emotionally engage with each other in their environment in appropriate ways. And so you also, though, articulate working within the boundaries of the practical demands of the job as a teacher, the contemporary landscape of schooling. And so I wonder what you would say about, is it possible to have this approach and continue to value true play in schools, and especially the early elementary years today? What might that look like?
Yeah, so I've always been an advocate for play, right? I was a kindergarten teacher, and in my classroom, students got 45 minutes to an hour of indoor play, and we got outdoor play every day. So I knew it was really important. And then I saw this decline in play as I go out and observe student teachers, right? No dramatic play area, no blocks in a kindergarten classroom, and play became learning centers where they had to sit and do math work in a small group, and we called that play, right? So I really saw play eroding out of the early childhood space, which I knew was problematic because that is the natural way that children learn and develop. And then I got introduced to Anji play and this idea of true play. So in a province in China, a rural province named Anji, Miss Chung spent 16 years really rethinking what play means and how play brings about joy in children. And so their 3 to 6-year-old programs are called kindergartens, right? They're publicly funded. And over time, she's developed what she calls this true play philosophy, where, you know, what I see a lot is what she called false play, which is the type of play we typically engage with students. Here's some toys, play with them in this way. I'm going to ask you these questions, and you're going to have fun, right? That's a very teacher directed type of play. And what they did in Anji was kind of, they took away all the materials that were very much one way designed and put these materials that were open-ended, that had multiple uses, to see what the children then did with them. And what you then saw is the children engaging in this form of true play, that they were engaging with materials and spending their time in ways that they chose, right, to explore. And what I've learned from, I went to the True Play Conference in Anji, China in May 2018. We have some schools that are implementing Anji in Wisconsin-Madison and California. So I've met educators across the world who are actually doing this, Vietnam and Budapest, right, all over, who are embracing this philosophy. And I think it's possible. I think it's needed. I think a global true play revolution is going to, 1, save early childhood, and 2, save the world, right? I do believe that, because when I saw these children in Anji, like, these kids are going to be the most powerful children in the world, not because they make the most money or their country's got the strongest GDP, but because they are so self-confident in who they are as people, and they're so able to, like, engage in something that really, that fuels their desire, that they really want to do, that they're going to have that kind of happiness that most people don't find in life, right? Because they spent so much time playing, right, and getting to know who they were and exploring. So I think it's possible, but what I'm realizing now, after just 2 years of doing this Anji Fellowship, is that teacher education, which I've been in for the past 16 years, is not prepared for this revolution, right? We don't prepare teachers to engage in true play. I teach teachers to make time for play in the classroom, to even assess children during play, and to value play, but it's very different when you're saying play is what children are doing in school. This is the way they're learning. And then what's the role of the teacher is very different, right? Teachers in Anji, they observe children playing more than they interact with them. They record children playing, and then they engage in a scaffolded reflection of that play with the children. It's a very different role, right, for teachers to do. And I think that's the work of how we make this happen. So it is possible. We have to change teachers' mindsets. I still have a lot of people think children are playing or learning. And I want them to recognize that children are always learning and children are always playing. And that is how they're doing both, right? Playing, teaching and learning should happen through play, right? But that's a different role for the teacher. So it's their beliefs and their attitudes. And then, because then teachers have to document what that learning then looks like. Instead of going in with your preset lesson plan on what you want children to do, right? You have to watch what children do and then document all the different learning that happened. What kind of cognitive skills were they demonstrating in that play? What kind of social and emotional skills? And then how can you scaffold that through reflection, through conversation, through new materials, right? Through new opportunities. So it's just a different approach, but I think it's possible if we're willing to take on that task.
Yeah, it's a tremendously challenging task. I mean, I like what you said about shift in mindset. And I think there's both the personal and political challenge of doing that, when sometimes I'll hear students not only say something like, there's play and then there's learning, but they might say, I just prefer a more structured classroom. But if you sort of break that down and reflect on it and deconstruct it enough, there's something there about what we've been conditioned to believe is valuable, and also what we've been told as a teacher about what's professional. I mean, there's something, I think, to the fact that as a teacher, you're supposed to be a holder of knowledge, and you're supposed to demonstrate that your capacity to teach children as it looks traditionally. And so, and I appreciate your comment that it lies in the hands of teacher education as well. It's not just a burden on teachers.
Yeah, it's both teacher education and parents as well. A big part of this true play is what we call risky play. And I mean, like literally what I saw in China, I don't see a lot of parents and teachers feeling comfortable with. I mean, but children have to determine for themselves what that level of risk is and whether they can manage it. And if we let them do that, they are the best at determining it. I saw children on risky structures who knew it was risky, and they stopped and they called in friends to come help them, right? Because they had to figure that out for themselves. It's not for me to step in and say, this is unsafe. I've taken away that learning opportunity for them. The other thing is I saw a lot of examples of how play leads to freedom and liberation, but the liberation is not just for the children, it's also for the adults. We get liberated from our constraints on what childhood should be, on what teaching should be, on what learning should be. And this is something that the presenters at the conference, some of Ms. Cheng's colleagues across China talked about, right? They have to liberate policymakers into thinking that children can't have this kind of life, right? They have to liberate themselves into thinking this isn't valuable. So it's like this dual type of liberation that happens, so it's a process, right? It's definitely a process and it takes time, but it's doable if people are open to it.
And an emotional and affective one. Your comment that really struck me, I think I'm going to have to think a lot more about, is what you said about children being able to feel powerful. And what is it that our normal approach to instruction and curriculum and classroom management, how does that affect students? How does that make them feel in the long term about who they are as a person and what they're capable of? So I really appreciate you sharing that piece as well. So I have gotten the opportunity to hear you speak on several panels recently, and sort of related to anti-racism work and affirming Blackness. And while anti-bias education and asset pedagogies certainly aren't new, there's been an increased discussion among teacher educators and pre-service teachers recently about approaches to equity and justice following the recent murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and others at the hands of police. I think that there are many students and pre-service teachers, many that are white, who may be wondering what to do in their daily work. I know I have gone through moments of thinking what I can do better as well and what I could have done better in the field. So from your experience as a teacher and professor and with Black Lives Matter at school, I'm wondering if you can speak specifically to early childhood educators who are interested in examining their own work. And are there any key considerations or practices that you might suggest for early childhood educators who are interested in racial equity, especially challenging anti-Blackness?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and a lot of this, I think, to me, ties into play as well, and I'll get to that. But it's definitely deeply connected for me. So yeah, everyone's reaching out now. I keep getting, oh, we want to do racial justice work, and you know, I will leave it for another discussion as to why now. But let's just say now is the time for this work. What I keep wanting to stress to people is, okay, maybe you read White Fragility, or you've read Stamped, the young adult version or the adult version, or you've read, so you want to talk about race or something, and that's great. Reading is a great way to do this. My eyes were completely opened up to racism in general when I read Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria by Beverly Tatum. But what I'm stressing to teachers is reading stuff is not enough. It doesn't mean you're ready to then teach anti-racism. So the Black Lives Matter at School Coalition, we've developed a curriculum using 13 guiding principles from the Movement for Black Lives statement of what they believe, right? We've taken 13 principles out of that statement and we develop a curriculum around that. And we ask teachers to teach the curriculum and do events related to the demands during the first week of February. And a lot of cities host like a curriculum fair to go over the materials, right? But this year, coming into our fourth national year, we are realizing that a lot of teachers aren't ready to do this work, and they enact a lot more harm if they're not ready to do this work. So maybe what we need you to do, think about these 13 guiding principles and how you embody them in your beliefs and your actions in your classroom before you're even ready to talk to them about children, right? Because so there's a lot of work, right? There's a lot of, you probably are familiar with the 4 I's of institutional oppression, right? Or the 4 I's of oppression, whether it's interpersonal, ideological, intrapersonal, and institutional, right? Like these different levels. And so it's the same thing with this work. So the 13 guiding principles are things like loving engagement, empathy, restorative justice, diversity, globalism, Black families, Black villages, intergenerational, trans affirming, queer affirming, collective value, Black women, unapologetically Black, right? So how are you then taking all of these principles and embodying them in your own lives? Because you can't just start talking to children about these things if you don't practice it, because kids are gonna call you out. This is what we've learned from the early childhood teachers doing this work, right? Kids will say, that's not very restorative justice, Miss Jones, right? Because they know now, right? So you have to really, it has to become part of your practice, and you have to really think about it. The other thing is, I want teachers to really think about what I've gotten from Ibram Kennedy's work, his book Stamped from the Beginning, and then the one he's done, the young adult version, which I just listened to, which is great, with Jason Reynolds, is this idea about racist ideas and how they show up in education, right? And so his idea, his saying is a racist idea is any idea that claims that any racial group is worse or less or better than another racial group, right? You know, we hear teachers all the time and say, well, they're just not motivated to learn, and they mean Black students, right? But in reality, that's a racist idea, because in every racial group, there are children who are not motivated to be in school. In every racial group, there are some parents who think that the public school is not really valuable for their child, right? Everyone, not just, people think this is just Black families or just immigrant families or just, it's not, it's every racial group, right? And so you have to get out of these racist ideas, and we all have them. Ibram Kennedy talks about his racist ideas and how he had to grapple with them. And as I read his work, I had to think about my racist ideas and how I have to grapple with them, right? Because they're everywhere, and they're how we see that. And so I think that's really important place for teachers to start. What are the racist ideas that impact your work that you may or may not be aware of, right? And that one is the biggest one. Those kids don't want to learn. Those parents don't value education. Those kids can't do the work, right? That, or they don't have a strong work ethic. Those are racist ideas, right? And we need to challenge them. And I think that's the place to start, is with his work, looking at that, and really the interpersonal. What do you know about Black people? What do you love about Black? Do you love Black people? Do you love Black culture? Do you know it and understand it? Because if you don't, how are you teaching it to your children, right? Like they're not gonna get it either. And maybe you don't know a lot about Black culture, and that's okay, right? And you can learn that stuff. But if you are saying racist ideas where they don't really have no culture, or their culture is slavery, that's horrifying, right? We still have kindergarten teachers who think it is okay to teach 5-year-olds about slavery. That is not Black people's history. That's American history, right? And it doesn't belong in a 5-year-old classroom, right? Before children can learn about slavery and civil rights, and they need to learn about Black villages and Black families and intergenerational and all of these things about Black people that are positive and foundational for affirming Black culture. And then when they get to the history lessons, they're ready to learn about America's history of enslavement and African people. That's not Black people's history, right? That's the history of this country and what was done to a group of people. And I think teachers need to really understand that, because too many people think they know about racism. They read this book and they want to go in there and teach it. And it can backfire. It can backfire in a lot of different ways.
I love what you brought up about knowing and loving Black culture. That was something I had taken both from Ibram Kendi's work and Dr. Bettina Love's work about, like, how can you say that you love Black students and Black culture if you don't know them and if you don't understand? And if you come from outside that culture, my argument, both as a teacher, as an adult, as an ethnographer, I'm always outsider. Like, I think that there's this value in always seeing yourself outside that. And so I think for especially white teachers who have been like the most well-read, and maybe they're working in a setting where they're not the majority in that particular classroom, that we might get sort of fooled into how much we know, or fool ourselves into how much we know, and fail to pay attention to the lives that are in front of us. Also, what you said about what's appropriate for bringing up at that age, it's interesting, because I think that slavery is something that in my school district, we learned about at a very young age. But it was that, you know, slavery happened and now it's over. And it was a big shift for me. And this might sound silly, but when I learned that just the difference between saying that Black people had been slaves and then saying that Black people were enslaved. And I had a conversation with my pre-service teachers about that. And it just had never been a thought because for our group, it never needed to be a thought. And I think that a lot of my teachers, pre-service teachers, and I could have gone on and succeeded without ever thinking about it. And that's sort of part of the point, that our students don't have that opportunity in the way that we did. At the same time, you're butting up against arguments that this is political and it doesn't belong in school, as if the discussion of American history was apolitical. But I wonder what it is that you would say to those folks, whether it's teachers, parents, or others outside the school system, often in the media, who might say that discussions about race and equity, or especially protests, are just political and indoctrinating or inappropriate with young children.
Yeah, and so first I want to thank you. Yes, I totally got that quote from Bettina Love, and I want to make sure that that comes from her, that idea of like, do you love Black people and Black culture, right? I hear her talk a lot, right? And I read her book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, which is really a great reading for folks. And she's actually started the Abolitionist Teaching Network, and they're doing like an event for white teachers. So I think that'd be great to share if you look them up as well. But yes, to your point, so I'm looking at it a couple different ways, right? So I'm really in early childhood, but since my dissertation was on youth civic engagement, I've kind of had my toe in social studies, right? And I go to the social studies teacher ed conference every year because a lot of those people are my friends, and I'm doing more work around thinking about that. And one of the ways I'm thinking about, like the 13 guiding principles, how do you teach them in a way that people say it's not political, it's a part of the curriculum, right? Well, one is to think about citizenship education and its idea of cultural citizenship, right? And a lot of cultural citizenship research is done on Latinx families and Asian families, right? But I think it also applies to Black people as well, too. And if you think about what citizenship education is, right? Unfortunately, we do in early childhood, and it's like learning about community helpers and that stuff. But at its genesis, citizenship education is to make people feel good about being members of a society, right? About being good about being an American. You're an American citizen. This is what it means. You're a good person, right? You get to live in this democracy. Well, if we think about Black children, they don't get that. They don't really get this positive view of themselves as citizens in this country. Often what we've gotten is second-class citizenship, right? From the inception of public schools, through the Jim Crow era, through today, and all the issues that we see, the racial injustice issues in public education, right? So to me, something like the 13 guiding principles in early childhood and in education is a form of cultural citizenship, right? And it becomes a part of that curriculum, right? That the schools actually have a responsibility to affirm Black culture and to make Black children feel like citizens, and to make all children see Black children as citizens, right? Because this work is not just for Black children, it's for all children, right? We can just imagine where we would be if for 2 generations, white children grew up learning about the 13 guiding principles and Black Lives Matter, and that distinction between someone who's a slave and someone who was enslaved, right? That's a very powerful distinction that a lot of people don't realize, like you said, the importance of that, because that changes the whole perception of what you're talking about. Same thing that we talk about people first language, right? We don't say people, we don't use disability language. We talk about the person first, right? And they're not their disability. It's the same thing here, right? No one was a slave. They were a human being who was enslaved, because then you have to think about who did the enslaving. And that's been a big part of this, is no one wants it, that we want to have slavery without slavers, right? We want to have racism without racists, and that's the problem, right? And so we have to really think about that language. So what I would tell people is, one, I don't have a problem with indoctrinating people to be anti-racist. And I will flat out say that, right? And I've been saying that I don't have a problem with indoctrinating children to be good people, right? We want to have character education and morals. We want children to know the difference between right or wrong. That is indoctrination. When we teach children don't steal and don't break the law. So why can't I indoctrinate you to not be racist, right? To not be oppressive, right? In who you are. I think that's an end goal for society that we should want. And that's something that we should ask public education to help us do. So that's kind of how I push back on that, right? Like these are just good citizen skills, right? Being an anti-racist is good citizenship. And we should want that. Just like We want you to vote, and we want you to pay your taxes, and we want you to recycle. We also want you not to be anti-racist, or to be anti-racist, right? So that should be a part of that. And I think people who say it's political, education is political. Teaching is one of the most political acts that we could ever do. Nothing is neutral. And if you go into it thinking that it's neutral, you're probably causing more harm.
Yeah, causing harm is a powerful point here, because I think that there could be criticism of talking about race in this way in schools as in some way harmful because it's political. But the way that you've just described it, in fact, not talking about it is what's doing harm. And engaging with children seems to be this approach to alleviating systemic harm, or working to in the small circles that you can. I also was really interested in what you said about person first language, because I've also in class discussions engaged with students who were anxious about what language they should use. And I have not done research related to race in schools, but I do research in disability studies and education. And so there is a disagreement sometimes in certain spaces around person first language, where certain groups, say deaf individuals or autistic individuals, might prefer not to use person first language because it can imply that something is wrong with them, or that their disability is separate from them. But it very much comes down to an individual person. And I've wondered the same thing about addressing that with students around race, where students sometimes don't want to say Black. Students want to say African American, or they want to say of African descent, or they want to say colored, and are hesitant to acknowledge color as difference. And so I wonder if you can also speak to that.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is the person with the disability, how they want to talk about themselves and how we talk about them, right? That's two totally different things. What I know of deaf culture, right, is that it is a culture, and they don't feel disabled by their deafness. And they want to, they're like, if they had the choice to not be deaf and to go undergo surgery, many of them would not necessarily pick that route, right? Like, there is pride in the deaf culture, from what I've known from the few educators that I've met in that space, right? This has come up before. And so, but that's different than how other people should be talking about them, right? So I, as a Black woman, I like to identify as Black, capital B Black. That's the other difference too, right? But I recognize that white people might not feel comfortable with that. And they might want to say African American as a sign of respect. And that's fine. I will tell you, I don't let my students say colored, right? And this is where it happens. I teach an online diversity course for Howard University. A lot of the students are in our counseling program, and they are from Saudi Arabia. We have a nice partnership with Saudi Arabians coming over, taking classes at Howard, getting a degree. They tend to say the word colored, right? International people tend to think that's still an okay word to use. And I have to spend a lot of time explaining to them why that word triggers a lot of Black people, right? Colored is not something we ever called ourselves, it's what other people called us. So I would push back on a college student who wanted to use that word and say, you can use African American if you're not comfortable with using Black. And when I say Black with a capital B, because then I think you're referring to a group of people, right? And so when I just read Black people with lowercase b, I just feel like that's a characteristic you're trying to separate who you're talking about. But when you say Black people with a capital B, you're talking about this specific group of people in this way that honors who they are. Now, not everyone agrees with me, right? I know some Black people who prefer to be called African American. That's totally okay. That's their right, right? But I think people have to realize the nuances with the language and really think about how they want to talk about another group. There might be some people that say white people shouldn't use the word Black like that, and they should use African American, right? It's going to be diversity in this thought throughout this conversation. No one's all going to agree on the right term, except that maybe we shouldn't be using the N word, right? And we get away from that. But I think you should really, just be respectful to hear what people want, and it's okay to ask people, how do you want to be referred? Do you want to be called African American? Do you want to be called Black? And just ask people that, and then see what they say. I would say the same thing to a person with a disability. How would you want me to introduce you, right? Or do you want me to even mention your disability at all? Or are you just your human being self, right? And we can get to your disability later. But I think it's being intentional and thinking about that as you do your work is what's more important than what you actually say, right? That you intentionally made sure the person that you were talking about was comfortable with the terms you were using. And that's how we get around with this, all of gender expansiveness, right? I hear a lot of people saying, it's not my preferred pronoun, right? When you speak about me, I prefer you use the words she and her or my name. Right? It's when you speak about me, I prefer you use they, them, or my name, right? It's not so much, or what my good friend of mine, a kindergarten teacher, says, the words that feel good to talk about me are, right? That's how she says it to little children, right? And that's what it is. Words are supposed to make you feel good about yourself, right? So when you're talking about me, the words that make me feel good are she and her. So it's just, and so we're even seeing shifts in that language. And I think the same thing applies to how we talk about race as well.
Yeah, the way that you're talking about language, I think, relates very much to how you talk about citizenship education and constructing a classroom community, insofar as the way that you refer to someone not only acknowledges that they are worthwhile and valuable, but pays tribute and value to their identity and the history that comes with it, the culture that comes with it. And so someone can easily, I think, with good intentions, write that off in ways that there are serious consequences for the person that you're engaging with. So I appreciate you sharing that perspective.
Yeah, and always, I would say, don't guess what people are. My mother, we're from Panama, so we're Black people from Panama. Panamanians speak Spanish, right? But, when you hear Black people with an accent, most people think they're Jamaican. So our whole lives, everyone goes to mom and say, are you Jamaican? And she gets so angry. So what I say to people, if you hear an accent in their voice, ask them, oh, you have an accent. Where are you from, right? And instead of just making that assumption, because that definitely gets a lot of people in trouble, right? Because you're probably not going to make the right guess. But now, instead of just saying that, and just now I hear people all the time, and I'm like, oh, you kind of sound like my mom. But I say, where are you from? And then I get a sense of that, instead of just implying that I know. And again, that's that purpose of, like, language should be used to make people feel good about themselves.
And asking people about themselves can feel a lot better than assuming.
And also, when you ask, though, you have to take their answer, right? I've seen people say, oh, where are you from? And someone will say, I'm from Texas. And they thought they were going to say Mexico or China, right? And they say, well, no, where are you really from? No, full stop. When you ask someone where they're from and they give you that first answer, that is the answer they're giving you. And if you're fishing for an ethnicity that you think they are, that needs to stop, right? Like, you need to accept the response that people get you. This happens a lot with folks who are from other, they're born in America, but obviously their parents might be from another ethnicity group, and someone's fishing for that information, and that could be dangerous as well too. So again, it's about accepting what people tell you, finding out what they want, how they want to be referred to, and then accepting the answers that they give you, right, as who they are, instead of, like, trying to get a different response out of them.
Yeah, I think it's really, what you're talking about sounds emblematic of your approach to the classroom and others' approach to the classroom, where you're asking students who they are, and that being that, and believing them, not just in the way that they describe themselves, but in the ways that they present themselves at school on any given day. And I think that's kind of a radical move. It shouldn't be, but I think it's kind of a radical move. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I hope to have conversations with you in the future about this. You've given me a lot to think about, and I know that my students will appreciate hearing from you as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to talk, and to talk with you or your students at another time would be great.